When the carpenter was fixing the stairs, he turned pale and said, "The steps have been sawed through. Someone wants you to fall." Right then, a text message came from my son. "Mom, come down quickly, I've arrived." I understood everything. I asked the carpenter to step aside and prepared a surprise meeting for my son, one that left him speechless. Greetings, dear listeners. Before I begin telling this complicated story of my life, I ask you to support our channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and write in the comments which city you are listening from. This is very important for us. And now, enjoy listening. I stood in the foyer of my family home, the familiar scent of polished oak and old books filling my senses, each corner steeped in decades of memory. The air was heavy with the faint tang of sawdust from the work Mr. Dalton had been doing. The carpenter's tools spread carefully across the hall like soldiers arrayed for inspection. At 65, I had grown accustomed to the quiet rhythms of caution, an intuition honed through years of navigating life's subtle hazards, and something in the way Mr. Dalton had stopped mid-step set every nerve on edge. He crouched near the bottom of the staircase, hands hovering above the wood as if afraid to touch it, his eyes widening in a rare, unguarded expression of fear. "Hannah, the steps, they've been sawed through. Someone wants you to fall." His voice was low, trembling just enough to break the ordinary cadence of speech, and the words seemed to lodge themselves in my chest, cold and impossible. My fingers, resting on the banister for balance, tightened without conscious thought. I had lived long enough to recognize danger in places where it should not exist, in the familiar, in what is trusted, in the home itself. I froze, my mind racing with questions that felt almost too immediate to voice. Sawed through? How? I breathed the words out slowly, not because I doubted the carpenter's warning, but because the idea was both absurd and terrifying. Who would want to harm me in my own home? The stairs, a fixture I had ascended and descended countless times, suddenly seemed alien, treacherous. My pulse thudded painfully in my ears. Every memory of the last decade, every step taken, every small triumph and failure, blurred as my attention sharpened into a singular focus, survival and understanding. Mr. Dalton's eyes flickered toward me, searching for reassurance, perhaps even guidance. He was a man who had worked quietly for decades, shaping wood with meticulous care, whose hands had restored every corner of this house. For him to look frightened was proof enough that this was no ordinary mishap. I noted the subtle tremor in his jaw, the faint pallor creeping across his cheeks, signs of someone who understood the gravity of the situation and feared for the consequences. My gaze returned to the staircase. The varnished oak steps, normally solid and dependable beneath my feet, now seemed frail, vulnerable, marked by the deliberate hand of someone who had studied my habits and knew how to exploit them. I ran my eyes over each tread, imagining the blade or saw's incision hidden beneath the surface, an invisible fracture waiting for the wrong moment. The thought made my stomach lurch. My age, my slower reflexes, the natural fragility of 65 years of life, all of it suddenly mattered. Then my phone buzzed, a sharp intrusion into the tension, cutting through the dread. I glanced down at the screen, and my heart almost stopped. A message from my son, Jacob, appeared. "Mom, come down quickly, I've arrived." Time seemed to distort. The ordinary hum of the house, the creak of the floorboards under my feet, the faint ticking of the clock above the doorway, the distant wind rattling a shutter outside, faded into irrelevance. My breath caught, not from fear alone, but from recognition. I understood, in a sudden, crystal-clear instant, What had been orchestrated? The trap was not random. It was deliberate. Someone had planned this, someone with knowledge of my movements, my habits, and my son. Memories surge forward unbidden. Jacob's last hurried phone call before leaving for work in the city, his tone anxious but clipped. The way he had lingered at the door, reluctant to say goodbye. The subtle tension I had ignored, attributing it to youthful impatience or the normal strain of adulthood. Now all those small fragments fell into a terrifyingly coherent pattern. He had arrived, he had planned something, and he expected me to take the bait. I steadied myself, inhaling deeply, letting the fear and adrenaline mingle in a precise equilibrium that only experience could teach. At 65, I had learned to parse danger from illusion, to weigh instinct against evidence. Every instinct screamed that the stairs were perilous, yet another part of me, quieter but insistent, recognized an opportunity, a chance to confront, to understand, and perhaps to respond in a way that even Jacob would not anticipate. Mr. Dalton remained crouched near the staircase, his expression one of helpless concern, hands poised as if ready to intervene but unsure how. I looked at him, and for the briefest moment our eyes met in unspoken agreement. I would handle this. I had the clarity, the patience, and the presence of mind that comes only with long life and long observation. And so I stood there, frozen yet resolute, my mind calculating each next move, each step I could safely take. The house, my memories, my son's impending arrival, all converged in that instant, and I felt the electric anticipation of what was to come, a mixture of dread, recognition, and a rare, undeniable thrill that I was about to face a challenge designed specifically for me, and one that I intended to master. Jacob had been away for months, entrenched in the relentless rhythm of his new job in the city, building a life I had only glimpsed through sporadic video calls and hastily typed messages. 6 months, half a year, without seeing him, and yet, as I stood in the foyer, absorbing Mr. Dalton's trembling words, it felt as if the absence had sharpened rather than dulled my awareness. Each familiar scent in the house, the polished wood of the staircase, the faint perfume of the hydrangeas I had left by the window, the lingering trace of last night's tea, seemed magnified, framing the moment in a peculiar clarity. My mind, ever analytical, began to untangle the strands of the situation, examining each detail, each anomaly. Who could have tampered with the stairs? My first thought was incredulity. No one would, or could, dare act in such a calculated manner in a house so well known, so deeply familiar. Yet the evidence was unmistakable. The carpenter had seen it. The steps had been sawed, weakened deliberately, invisibly. The act itself suggested intent, planning, a careful orchestration designed to exploit trust, timing, and familiarity. I could imagine the work required, the patience needed to study the staircase, to anticipate my movements, to determine precisely when I might approach. Whoever had done this knew me intimately, or, at the very least, knew my patterns. Then the message arrived from Jacob. "Mom, come down quickly, I've arrived." At first my chest tightened with dread. The immediate impulse of fear surged, a mother's protective instinct responding to a potential threat. But as I reread the text, parsing the words for nuance, for subtle inflection and meaning, a realization began to crystallize. The danger was deliberate, yes, but it was not aimed at harming me. It was a trap, of sorts, carefully constructed not to injure, but to provoke, to challenge, to engage my attention in a way that only someone with an intimate understanding of me could have engineered. Jacob, the name repeated in my mind like a refrain, its resonance amplified by the uncanny timing, the audacity of it all. The son I had nurtured, corrected, advised, sometimes scolded, was the only one who had reason, motive, and opportunity. The puzzle began to form. Jacob had orchestrated the danger, guided the setup, and timed his arrival to maximize the tension. The stairs were not merely a staircase. They were a stage. The house was not merely a home. It had been transformed, subtly, into a theater of anticipation, a test of perception, courage, and wit. I considered the psychology behind it. Jacob had always been observant, intelligent, sometimes startlingly so. Even in his adolescence, he had a streak of ingenuity, an ability to manipulate circumstance to his advantage, to create scenarios that forced reflection, that demanded attention. This was no different. He had waited until I was alone with Mr. Dalton, until the threat could be perceived but not acted upon rashly. He had chosen a medium, danger, that was simultaneously immediate and symbolic, a way of asserting presence, demanding acknowledgement, and challenging me in a way only he could orchestrate. My pulse quickened, but it was no longer from fear alone. A thrill of intrigue laced the rhythm, a recognition of the intellectual game that had been laid out before me. The danger was a lure, a puzzle deliberately designed to engage me. I felt the familiar stirrings of excitement that accompany the sudden recognition of a challenge tailored to one's own capabilities. At 65, I had long cultivated patience, observation, and strategic thought. In my mind, the house became a chessboard, the sawed steps a gambit, Jacob the elusive opponent whose moves I was now beginning to trace. I examined every angle. The distance from the front door to the first broken step, the likely path I would take, the visibility of each potential hazard, the placement of furniture, the subtle cues of lighting. Each element was deliberate. Each detail whispered the personality of its orchestrator, precise, daring, audacious, yet affectionate in a manner that only a child of mine could manifest. I realized, with a mixture of relief and admiration, that Jacob had crafted a scenario that was as much about connection as it was about mischief, as much about forcing me to pause and notice him as it was about creating suspense. The more I analyzed, the more the edges of panic softened, replaced by the controlled, almost meditative focus that comes when a mind identifies the structure of a challenge. This was not random. This was intention, and the intention was unmistakably his. My fingers itched with anticipation, not to react impulsively, but to plan, to counter, to turn the tables in a way that would acknowledge his cleverness while asserting my own experience and foresight. As I stood there, absorbing the significance of every detail, every pattern, I understood. This moment was not merely about avoiding a fall. It was about recognition, about the unspoken language between parent and child, about the subtle assertion of presence that had been waiting 6 long months to be fully realized. And in that realization, my fear transformed into something far more potent, a thrill of intellectual engagement, a spark of maternal pride, and an almost imperceptible smile, anticipating the next move in a game that only we could play. I turned slowly to Mr. Dalton, my gaze steady and unyielding. The carpenter had been a comforting presence, steady hands and practiced expertise bridging my trust in his work, yet even he seemed to sense the magnitude of what was unfolding. "Step aside, please," I said, my voice calm but firm, a command without hesitation. The words hung in the foyer, quiet but sharp, and I could feel the slight tremor in his frame, the uncertainty of a man who knew the house's hidden danger better than anyone else. He looked at me, hesitation written across his lined features, the familiar stoicism of his years of craft giving way to something closer to awe. "Are you sure, Hannah?" His question was more than simple curiosity. It carried weight, a mixture of fear and disbelief. He had always known me as careful, precise, methodical, never reckless. To see me embrace the risk, to deliberately place myself within the potential danger, seemed to fracture the very image he held of me. "Yes, trust me. I know exactly what's happening," I replied, the words leaving no room for argument, no space for doubt. I could see the flicker of comprehension cross his face, a silent acknowledgement of the awareness I had cultivated, of the intuition that guided me through decades of life and long experience. This was not impulsiveness. This was strategy, observation, and foresight distilled into a single deliberate decision. I could feel it then, Jacob's presence, not yet physical, but hovering in the air between text and reality, a vibration of expectation carried through the very fabric of the moment. His message had been instantaneous, brief, urgent. "Mom, come down quickly. I've arrived." That urgency, that insistence, was the thread I intended to follow, weaving it into my own design. The house, quiet and waiting, seemed suddenly alive, each creak of the floor, each shadow cast by the late afternoon sun, lending itself to the suspense that was about to unfold. I allowed my mind to stretch over every possible outcome, mapping the staircase in my imagination with the precision of a chess master. Each broken step was a calculated variable, a potential misstep that demanded acknowledgement. But my intention was not to avoid the challenge entirely. It was to manipulate it, to turn the danger into an instrument of surprise. Every detail mattered: the angle of the banister, the thickness of the tread at the riser's edge, the subtle play of light and shadow across the polished wood. My body felt the weight of experience, every movement preemptively calibrated to navigate the hazard without revealing the full extent of my understanding. Mr. Dalton stepped back slowly, his hands raised in quiet acquiescence, the weight of my decision resting in the space between us. I could see his relief mingling with lingering apprehension. It was a relief that I was not acting out of desperation or panic, an apprehension born from recognition that this was no ordinary task. My voice, steady and unflinching, had conveyed authority, but the unspoken message was far more intricate. I knew exactly what this was, who had orchestrated it, and how I intended to respond. I closed my eyes for a moment, breathing in the faint scent of varnish and polished wood, and allowed myself to inhabit the perspective Jacob must have assumed. He believed I might hesitate, that the sight of danger alone could provoke caution, uncertainty, perhaps even retreat. But I had long since learned to read him, to anticipate the subtle cues that marked his intentions. This moment, this precise juncture, was where I could assert myself, not through force, but through the surprise of my own calculation, my own insight. I envisioned the scene as he would, my figure poised at the top of the staircase, eyes calm, hands relaxed but alert, the tension in the house palpable, as if every wall, every shadow, were holding its breath. He would expect hesitation, he would expect caution, perhaps even fear. Instead, I planned to meet him with certainty, a quiet assertion that the trap, while ingenious, had been recognized and outmaneuvered. The thrill that accompanied the realization was subtle but undeniable, a mixture of anticipation and maternal pride. Here was a challenge designed by my son, clever, audacious, meant to provoke reaction. And here I was fully aware, fully engaged, ready to turn the tables, ready to convert the intended surprise into my own. My pulse thrummed with controlled excitement, a rhythm dictated by intellect rather than instinct, by strategy rather than reflex. I opened my eyes and looked down the staircase, visualizing Jacob's approach, every potential angle and entry point, the exact moment when his message's urgency would collide with my deliberate calm. This was more than a confrontation. It was a meeting of minds, an intricate dance of perception and awareness. Each movement I considered, each subtle shift of my weight, each measured breath, was a part of the strategy, a silent communication across the distance between us, bridging absence and presence, threat and understanding. I felt the power of experience, of intuition honed over decades, guiding me through the moment with precision. The house, the broken steps, Mr. Dalton, and Jacob's unseen presence, all converged into a single coherent frame. I was ready, every detail aligned, every calculation considered, every instinct sharpened. The stage was set, the trap understood, and I was prepared not merely to react, but to orchestrate the next moment entirely on my terms. I moved deliberately, each step measured, as if I were treading across a tightrope stretched between anticipation and patience. The staircase loomed before me, familiar yet treacherous now, each damaged step a silent warning of what could have been disaster. My feet instinctively avoided the compromised wood, guided by both Mr. Dalton's caution and my own careful inspection. Even in a house I had known for decades, every shift of light across the polished rails and every subtle echo from the walls seemed to carry meaning, as if the house itself were attuned to the tension I felt. My first task was to reclaim control, to turn a trap into a stage for surprise, and for that, every element had to be precise. I moved furniture with careful consideration, sliding the worn armchair just enough to guide the trajectory I envisioned, nudging the side table to catch the soft glow of the lamp so that shadows would dance in all the right directions. The lighting was critical, not too bright to ruin the drama, not too dim to obscure the details that I wanted him to see. My hands, though lined and aged, worked with the steady confidence of decades spent arranging and rearranging the spaces I had lived in, molding the familiar into something extraordinary. Candles were next. I selected those with the faintest vanilla scent, delicate but noticeable, and placed them in asymmetrical clusters across the living room. Each flame would flicker against the walls, casting subtle patterns, drawing attention without overwhelming. I wanted the room to feel alive, welcoming, almost conspiratorial in its warmth. It was more than decoration. It was a gesture, an unspoken conversation between mother and son, built from the language of anticipation, surprise, and connection. I turned to the small bouquet I had prepared, a selection of tulips and daisies in shades I knew he loved. The ones he always picked for his first apartment in the city, a memory I had tucked away and preserved in quiet reverence. I placed them on the corner table by the sofa, just at eye level, ensuring they would catch his attention the moment he entered. The simplicity of flowers was deceptive. They carried history, intimacy, and the silent message that he was expected, remembered, and loved. The note was the final touch. I selected a sheet of heavy cream stationery, the texture pleasing beneath my fingertips, and wrote the words slowly, deliberately, aware of how each letter might land in his mind. "Welcome home, Jacob. I've been waiting." No exclamation points, no embellishments, just the calm authority of a mother who had orchestrated this entirely, who had anticipated every move, and who now held the scene together with quiet mastery. I imagined his eyes scanning the room, landing on the note, feeling the calculated care behind it, and perhaps letting himself relax in the knowledge that this was not simply a trap. It was a welcome, a homecoming staged with love and cunning alike. As I stepped back to survey the living room, I felt a pulse of satisfaction. At 65, I rarely indulged in moments of deliberate theatricality, yet here I was fully immersed in it, and the thrill coursing through me was unmistakable. It wasn't youthful recklessness or naive exuberance. It was a refined, deliberate pleasure, a rare combination of intellect and emotion that reminded me that life, even at this stage, still offered opportunities for cleverness and delight. The placement of each object had to interact with the path I had traced, a corridor of safety around the sabotaged steps, leading him from entry to discovery, from curiosity to astonishment. I envisioned the scene through his eyes, the staircase first, a moment of suspense, followed by the living room's warm embrace, the careful play of shadows, the hint of scent, the bouquet, the note. It was choreography, psychology, and emotion, all fused into a single coherent experience. I could almost see the subtle shift in his expression, the quickened heartbeat that mirrored my own, the recognition of effort, love, and wit woven seamlessly into the environment. I paused to adjust the last candle, ensuring its flame would not betray my careful symmetry. Each movement was intentional, each decision deliberate. The thrill of control, of anticipation, of secret knowledge mingled with a profound tenderness. I realized, with surprising clarity, that this was more than a game or a surprise. It was a conversation conducted through atmosphere, arrangement, and timing, a silent acknowledgement of the distance that months had created and the closeness that could never be diminished. Even in the quiet of the room, I could feel it, the presence of what was coming, the intangible weight of expectation. My heart beat steadily now, but with an edge of exhilaration that seemed almost youthful, a reminder that cunning, creativity, and the capacity to astonish do not fade with age. I took a final, careful step back, surveying the scene as if from a stage, and allowed myself a private smile, warm and satisfied. The stage was set, the path clear, and the encounter awaiting its first note. The front door creaked, a sound that seemed louder than it had any right to be in the quiet of the afternoon. I had positioned myself so that I could see nothing yet take in everything. The soft rustle of his coat, the faint scuff of shoes against polished wood, the subtle vibrations in the floorboards that heralded his approach. Jacob's voice rang out, unmistakable and bright, carrying a mixture of triumph and relief that made my chest tighten. "Mom, I'm here." I stayed still, invisible yet acutely aware, every nerve attuned to his presence. There was a strange thrill in the concealment, a feeling that time itself had slowed, stretching each second so that I could examine it in its entirety. I could hear the way he inhaled, the tiny shuffle of his boots against the rug, the quickened rhythm of his pulse through the creaks and echoes of the house. At 65, I had learned to read such details, to interpret the subtle signals of people around me, and now every instinct was engaged. He moved toward the staircase, each step deliberate, yet betraying the slightest hesitation. I noticed the way his eyes flicked downward, scanning, calculating, the momentary catch of breath that betrayed awareness, the micro-expression of surprise and recognition. His intuition, sharpened by years of cleverness and instinct, had caught the discrepancy. The way the staircase no longer seemed wholly safe, the almost imperceptible misalignment of the steps under the soft lamplight. The pause was brief but charged, a crackling moment of suspended awareness that I savored in silence. I did not move. I let him occupy the space, allowed the suspense to swell, letting anticipation tighten around us like a held breath. The seconds stretched long enough to be measured, a tension that was at once delicious and exacting. The scent of the tulips reached him subtly now, mingling with the faint vanilla of the candles. I imagined him catching the hint of fragrance, a subconscious signal, drawing him forward, grounding him even as the mind raced to interpret every anomaly in his surroundings. Each detail mattered. The soft flicker of candlelight on the walls, the subtle shadows dancing across the furniture I had arranged, the way the bouquet caught the lamplight just so. These were all cues, invisible but potent, shaping perception, guiding curiosity, and deepening the moment's impact. I watched his eyes track the environment, noting the brief tilt of his head as he noticed something unusual, the subtle tightening of his jaw as comprehension flickered. It was the instant of realization that someone had thought ahead, that this space had been prepared, that every element had been designed with intention. I could hear his breath catch again, a softer, quieter acknowledgement of the subtle warning embedded in the environment. The stairs, damaged though they were, had been circumspectly avoided, as if I had left just enough for him to infer caution, to feel the implied challenge without danger. The ingenuity of it, I knew, would not escape him for long, and I reveled in the anticipation of that discovery. My pulse mirrored his excitement, yet mine was tempered with control, a deliberate steadiness I had cultivated over decades. The silence between us was alive. I felt it pressing, expanding, shaping the space, giving every sound meaning, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the faint creak of the radiator as it cooled, the almost imperceptible tapping of his fingers against the stair railing. I imagined him thinking he had detected a trap, calculating the risk, weighing the trust he placed in me against the uncertainty of what lay ahead. This was exactly the effect I had intended. The subtle interplay between expectation and surprise, between instinct and emotion, was what made the moment rich, layered, and electric. I allowed myself a quiet, private smile, unseen but fully present. At 65, moments like this were rare, instances where intelligence, anticipation, and emotion converged to create a private theater of understanding and intrigue. The thrill of having orchestrated this encounter, of having prepared the environment so that it spoke without words, filled me with a warmth I had not anticipated. It was not merely the anticipation of Jacob's presence. It was the satisfaction of knowing that the scene, the trap, and the welcome all converged into a single coherent experience. I felt him take another step, the hesitation lingering just long enough to deepen the tension, the almost imperceptible weight of expectation pressing through the floorboards, into the air, into the space between us. I stayed where I was, a shadow waiting to be acknowledged, a carefully controlled variable in the unfolding narrative. Each second stretched, elongated, charged with the power of anticipation. Every detail I had placed, the lighting, the flowers, the note, the careful arrangement of furniture, was now alive, performing their role in the quiet drama. I breathed slowly, savoring the heightened awareness, the intimacy of observation, the control of timing. Jacob was close, yet unaware that the moment had already been shaped, that the stage had been perfectly prepared for him, that every element had been considered to create the exact effect I intended. I let the silence hang, letting it swell, letting it inform him, letting it speak, letting it build to the instant that would define the encounter. "Jacob," I called softly, my voice threading through the quiet tension that had filled the house moments before. I stepped forward from the shadows, the warmth of the living room spilling onto my face and hands, the candles flickering as if in acknowledgement of the moment. My heart thrummed, not with fear, but with a particular thrill that came from the culmination of careful planning and anticipation, the precise orchestration of surprise. The risk, though controlled, had been exhilarating, the stakes high enough to make the reveal unforgettable. His eyes widened immediately, scanning the room with a mixture of astonishment and awe. I watched him take in the bouquet, his fingers instinctively reaching out as though he could absorb its fragrance through mere sight. The soft vanilla scent of the candles mingled with the gentle fragrance of the flowers, wrapping the room in a sensory layer that spoke louder than words. Jacob's gaze shifted to the note on the table, and I could see his mind working, parsing the handwriting he knew so well, tracing the deliberate strokes of each letter. "Mom, what is all this?" His voice was a mixture of confusion, admiration, and the faintest hint of guilt, as if he recognized the effort it must have taken and simultaneously felt the playful sting of having been outwitted. I allowed the silence to stretch, giving him time to absorb the environment I had so carefully curated. Each element, every detail, from the meticulous arrangement of furniture to the careful path avoiding the compromised steps, was now a statement, a proof of intent, a demonstration of subtle control and maternal ingenuity. I smiled, a soft, private curl of lips, allowing him to linger in the recognition of the scene. The lighting played across his features, illuminating the surprise and the curiosity that mingled there. I could see him analyzing, wondering, perhaps even recalculating the trap he had presumably planned for me. There was an unspoken dialogue in that silence, a conversation conducted entirely through glances, atmosphere, and shared history. "You set a trap for me," I said gently, letting the words hang between us. My tone was calm, warm, but carried the undercurrent of mischief, the subtle thrill of having anticipated his youthful cunning. I stepped further into the room, deliberately exposing the careful avoidance of the damaged steps, the deliberate choreography of the space. Each movement was a signal, a proof that I had been aware, alert, engaged, and in control. Jacob's eyes darted back and forth between the elements I had arranged, from the note to the flowers to the safe passage I had traced. His mouth opened slightly, words forming but retreating as he struggled to find the language for a moment that had upended his expectations. The usual confidence of youth, the assumption that he could orchestrate surprise unchallenged, was replaced by an almost childlike awe, tempered with reluctant admiration. But I knew it. I continued, my voice soft yet clear. "I wanted to make this meeting memorable, too." There was a pause, pregnant and deliberate, allowing him to absorb not only my words, but the sentiment beneath them. The love, the cleverness, the delight in outmaneuvering a son who prided himself on ingenuity. It was a lesson wrapped in warmth, a reminder that while he had grown, some things, intention, care, wit, remained firmly within my domain. He remained silent, momentarily overwhelmed, the speechlessness itself a testament to the success of the plan. I laughed softly then, a light, triumphant sound, one that mingled relief with amusement, triumph with maternal satisfaction. It was a laugh born not of mockery, but of shared delight, of the exquisite balance between control and surprise, of the rare joy of having orchestrated a scenario that elicited pure, unguarded astonishment. I watched him take tentative steps forward, each movement careful, eyes darting between the candles, the flowers, the safe path I had traced through danger. The realization that he had been anticipated, that his cleverness had been mirrored, and in some ways exceeded, seemed to settle over him slowly. There was admiration there, though mingled with disbelief, and I allowed it to bloom, relishing the private victory, the quiet affirmation that age and experience could still command attention, elicit awe, and shape the moment with precision. The room seemed to pulse with the shared energy of our encounter. Anticipation dissolved into recognition, fear into delight, tension into warmth. I felt the culmination of planning, the thrill of risk, the satisfaction of execution, all flowing together in a single tangible wave that filled the space between us. For that moment, the house, the lights, the scents, the carefully plotted path, and the note were no longer objects. They were extensions of me, conduits for the silent conversation that passed between mother and son, bridging months of absence with one exquisitely orchestrated reveal. And there he stood, speechless, absorbed in the moment, and I allowed myself one final, private smile, savoring the rare and delicate perfection of triumph mingled with love. The trap had become a stage, the risk a thrill, the encounter an unforgettable testament to the bond we shared and the cleverness we both possessed. Jacob ran toward me, his steps uneven with the excitement that made his movements almost reckless, and I felt a thrill at the sight. There is something irrepressible about watching a child, your child, move with pure, unfiltered emotion, and at that moment, all the months of absence, the messages, the missed calls, the small, nagging worry about whether he was well, all melted into insignificance. He reached me in one swift motion, arms wrapping around me with a strength that belied his 6 months away. His weight pressed against me, and I felt the tension I hadn't realized I carried loosen in an instant. "Mom, you got me," he whispered into my hair, voice muffled but full of laughter, disbelief, and affection. The words themselves seemed to vibrate through my chest, a physical acknowledgement of the success of my little scheme, and yet more than that, they carried the raw relief of reunion. I held him close, arms encircling him firmly, feeling the years of distance, both literal and emotional, dissolve. The warmth of his presence, the solid reality of him beside me, eclipsed any memory of worry or caution, any lingering thought of the potential danger that had once lurked in those sawed-through steps. At 65, I have learned that life's most precious moments often arrive disguised as ordinary events, or, in our case, orchestrated chaos. I could feel the pulse of our shared heartbeat, the rhythm of familiarity and history vibrating between us. Even with the thrill of the surprise, the cleverness of my plan, and the careful orchestration of every element, from the safe path to the candles and flowers, the real triumph was this: the palpable reconnection, the unspoken acknowledgement that despite months apart, some things never change. The bond between mother and son, the way a shared look can communicate volumes, the supple laughter that follows a successful trick, all of it lingered in the air like a delicate, invisible thread weaving us back together. Jacob pulled back slightly, his face lifted toward mine, and his eyes shone with something equal parts amazement and admiration. The initial shock of the reveal had transformed into unguarded delight. He shook his head, laughing softly, the kind of laugh that carries relief and surprise in equal measure, and I mirrored it, a quiet sound of satisfaction and joy that came from seeing him safe, amused, and connected. His lips curved into a smile that reached his eyes, and I could see that beneath the layers of adulthood, responsibility, and distance, he was still my boy, mischievous and impulsive, capable of both daring and wonder. The carpenter, Mr. Dalton, lingered at the edge of the room, leaning lightly against the doorway with arms crossed, his expression softened from concern to amused resignation. "I should have known better than to worry about you, Hannah," he said, shaking his head, the lines of age and experience on his face etched with gentle admiration. There was no scolding, no chastisement, only acknowledgement that, despite appearances, I had orchestrated the situation perfectly, navigated the potential peril, and emerged with both humor and authority intact. I gave him a small, knowing wink, letting the subtle glint of triumph sparkle in my eyes. Some lessons, I said softly, letting the weight of the words carry through the room, are meant to be learned the hard way, even by your son. The room seemed to absorb the statement, the echoes of laughter, sighs of relief, and the faint rustle of clothing as Jacob shifted closer, creating a cocoon of warmth and shared understanding. He looked at me with a mixture of pride, exasperation, and newfound respect, as if realizing that, for all his planning and cleverness, some forms of wisdom, subtle, patient, experience honed, were simply unmatchable. I could feel my chest swell with satisfaction, not from a desire to dominate or prove a point, but from the rare and delicate joy of having orchestrated a meaningful moment that would linger in memory. The candles flickered gently, casting a soft, forgiving light across the room, highlighting the flower's subtle bloom, the careful placement of each object, and the path I had traced through danger. In the quiet aftermath, I understood fully the profound simplicity of the moment. Jacob was here, safe and laughing, the trap averted not by chance, but by forethought, and in the midst of it all, the bond between mother and son reaffirmed itself in a single embrace, a single shared laugh, a single unspoken acknowledgement of love and cleverness intertwined. The air seemed to hum with satisfaction, the room saturated with emotion, anticipation, relief, joy, and triumph mingling like perfume, leaving nothing empty, nothing neglected. The danger had become the vehicle, the cleverness had become the bridge, and the reunion, the hug, the whispers, the laughter, was the destination, vivid and complete. In that moment, at 65, I realized anew that life's richest victories often arrive quietly, in shared glances, in subtle triumphs, in the laughter of someone you love after a carefully laid plan succeeds perfectly. And as Jacob's arms held me, and my laughter mingled with his, and the faint scent of candles and flowers lingered in the air, I felt the exquisite clarity of a single truth. Some bonds, some joys, some victories remain timeless, unshakable, and profoundly unforgettable.